All right, everybody. Well, bienvenidos. Welcome. I'm really glad to have everybody here. Really excited for this panel to have a really good discussion. To give a little context, we're going to be talking about the term Latinx and how it really has caused incredible amounts of conflict within our community, right? And so battles are reminiscent of the switch from Hispanic to Latino. And as a community, we're really reshaping this concept of Latinidad. So in this conversation, we really want to dive into and engage on queerness and how that shows up in the Latinx community, and what coalition requires or what is required of us to really continue to push these boundaries. So I'm going to just start off with quick introductions. Well, folks can introduce themselves. I'll start off to make it easy. So my name is Sergio Gonzalez. My pronouns are él, he, him, and currently I'm a PhD candidate at Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. If you want to go ahead and take it away, Maria.
Yeah, my name's Maria Aceves, and I'm an investment operations analyst with Capital Group. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I participate largely in our corporate community, CG Unidos and CG Pride, which represent both our Latinx and LGBTQIA plus communities within our corporate structure.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria. And then Mario, go ahead.
Hey, everyone. Mario Carrosco. Pronouns are he, him. I'm a co-founder of the market research firm ThinkNow. We help companies create culturally sensitive advertising to Latinx, Black, and Asian communities in the US. Co-founded, it's going to be 10 years, almost 11 years ago. We've done a lot of work on understanding kind of the adoption of the term Latinx. So excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then last but not least, Jaime.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jaime Barajas. My pronouns are he, him, she, her. I'm gender fluid. And I run Jota Reads, which is a Bookstagram through Instagram, where we do a monthly Queer Joy Book of the Month. And so we talk about different aspects of not just being queer, but also larger sense of people of color in the US and centering joy in our queerness. So.
Thank you for that. So let's just get right into this, y'all. So the first question, and I'm going to start us off with Jaime, if that's okay. So how was the leader in you born?
I feel like the leader in me born through overcoming adversity. I feel like growing up, both low income, we were, this is going to be funny because Sergio and I grew up together, so he has a similar experience. We grew up in a predominantly Latino, Black, and Polynesian community. Most of us were working class. And so therefore, there was a lot of things that we had to overcome before we could even think about thinking of ourselves as leaders. I think we were just trying to survive at the beginning. And on top of that, there's rules that are set that society puts on us, especially how we are able to behave, how we're able to exist, what does safety look like, especially for those of us that are influenced by things like religion, and such and so forth. So I think that my leadership became when I started breaking traditions and I started becoming my whole self, when I started self-affirming a lot more. When I started not following stereotypes or just being my authentic self. And so I feel like through that, I feel like true, genuine, authentic leadership started developing. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. And then Maria.
Yeah, absolutely. I think very similar to Jaime. It's kind of born out of facing the challenges and having to overcome. My parents both immigrated to the United States in their teens with nothing more than an elementary level education. So they brought with them very conservative, very religious beliefs. And as the non-binary Latinx, it wasn't really accepted. I was expected to be home, clean, cook, get married, have children. And that's just wasn't the trajectory of my life. So at some point I find myself homeless. Parents kind of that strong approach to, well, you're going to be what we want you to be, or you're not going to be here with us. So I find myself without a family, without a home, having to figure it out. And from that, perseverance, pushing through, making a life of my own, and I'm hoping to be a leader that shares that experience and brings up some of the youth that face the same challenge, because we are more likely to be homeless and left by our families because we are part of the LGBTQIA plus community.
So real, thank you for sharing that. And Mario.
Yeah, I think what Jaime mentioned about, embracing authentic self, that resonated with me. I think, I was born in Los Angeles and moved to a neighborhood, for those of you familiar with LA, kind of right outside of LA in Simi Valley. When I started elementary school, predominantly white neighborhood, which was a culture shock for me. And at that point, like, I really lived two lives, right? Like that, speaking Spanish at home, being Mexican American, and then, living in Simi Valley, one of three Latino kids in the neighborhood. So really thinking about, how I internalize these traditional kind of white markers of success and self throughout my whole childhood, until I got to college, studied literature, got a master's in literature, being exposed to Chicana literature. I mean, I think that's when I started to really embrace a whole side of myself, and got a job in marketing and Hispanic business, kind of one of the pioneers, Jesus Chavarria, who was actually one of the first tenured Latino professors at UCSB, where I saw, Latino in a leadership position, an entrepreneur. When I realized that I was able to bring kind of my full self, my background, my language in a corporate setting, I think was when it really was a game changer for me, and I stepped into my own as a leader.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think to wrap this question up, I think what you all have said on like bits and pieces like come to life for me, right? Definitely what Jaime brought up, this notion of adversity. And it was because I was confronted with either do or die, fight or flight, right? Like I have to survive or I just have to like let go. And I think for me that really came when I went to college. And so as Jaime told you, we grew up in the same neighborhood, grew up in the Bay Area, went to the same public high school. And then I ended up going to college in New York. I went to Manhattanville College, which is a very small liberal arts college, very bourgeois kind of education, right? And I remember I walked into Manhattanville thinking, I've never been catered to in such a way. My classes are like 15 to 20 students max, when I came from a public high school where we were like 40 students in a class, like, smushed in a classroom, sometimes sitting on the floor, like, or not having enough textbooks that you had to share, to all of a sudden they're like, they know my name. And they're like, hey, you weren't in class last week. And you're like, like, that I'm from California, so I have to live on campus, right? There's no way to do this whole virtual thing back then. So I was like, dealing with that, right? And then coming into myself, I think, trying to understand who I was, because like Mario brought up, right now I'm living kind of two separate lives. I came from the hood in the Bay Area to all of a sudden I'm in this very elitist, what I feel is like this is an elitist kind of space, right? Like people here are very like, oh, I'm supposed to be here, and I'm on this aspect of I'm so lucky to even have been accepted into this space, and having to navigate how am I going to come into myself, understanding the complexities that are me, right? But I think it was that, like, maybe that's what lit a fire under me to be like, hey, you have to like learn to find yourself, learn to like study what you want to study, right? Where I ultimately got a degree in communications, but learn to love yourself and embrace yourself in this process, because you couldn't do it in this bubble back home. And so now you're in a space where you kind of have like a fresh start, and people are going to get to know you, how you decide to identify, how you decide to show up in a space. So it was hard, right? Because I went across the country, I had no family. So one of my best friends and I went to school together, but we had very different careers, right? So different majors, different classes. And so as much as, yes, we had each other, we were still like, we're venturing in like a whole new space and trying to figure ourselves out and like how we show up in this space, which I think was one of the, to this day, I'm like, this is one of the best decisions of my life. And I think that really like catapulted me to really become the Sergio that I am today. So that really helped me a lot. And so, well, for the next question, and I'm going to have Maria start us off with this one. When did you first begin to understand the depth of your identity? What was your first step post the aha moment?
Yeah, I think for me, that kind of aha moment happens when I realize I'm gay, right? Because you grow up, you have a certain understanding of what your life is supposed to be like and what it's supposed to look like. And I have my first kiss from a girl, and it just kind of dawns on me. Everything that felt so different and so off about me makes sense. So you start to work through that whole, how am I going to disappoint my parents? How is this going to impact my life? And for a period of time, you almost want to disown your own self because you just don't understand how you could be different in such a negative way, right? Because that's what we're taught to think. And it connects all back to it. And there's a decision to be made. You know, do I live authentically? Do I try to conform, which happens quite frequently? And for me, I just couldn't be someone I wasn't. You know, from the very beginning, girls were not supposed to play sports. I love sports and I was good at them. So it was this battle with my family to always just be myself. So when that aha moment happens, it's like, okay, now what? What do I do? And it became a survival. And I was the first gay kid that was openly gay in my high school. I wasn't the first gay kid in my high school, but I started to live my authentic self, and I started to see my peer group kind of growing, and there was more queer, peers within the school, and you could see it grow. And for me, it was, this is what it is. I got to live my authentic life. And even though in certain scenarios, I still try to balance it, not be obvious, not be someone that was going to get highlighted and maybe bypass for opportunities because of it. It really showed me that the more I represented myself as an authentic version of myself, the more I could help the community that honestly really struggles with it. And the impacts can be large because you start to go through, suicide thoughts and all of these things that you have to work through just to become your authentic self.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's so real. And Mario.
Yeah, I think I touched a little bit on an aha moment for me when I worked at Hispanic business, but kind of reflecting a little more. I mean, being in a kind of going the corporate route, right? Previous to me being a founder, oftentimes I was the only Latino in the room, and really picked up my cues from others in the room and coworkers and how I thought I should act. But I think a real shift in perspective for me was when I worked at a small company previous to founding ThinkNow called Garcia Research. That company, similar to ThinkNow, kind of but focused only on researching Latinx in the US, founded by one of the pioneers in the market research industry, Carlos Garcia. He came up with the idea of retroculturation, and just like an amazing company, Latino owned and operated. And the first time I was in a place with, other Latinx people, master's degrees, that brought their whole selves, right? Like, just, and I just realized like how much I was, playing a role in other corporate settings, and this company really shifted my perspective in terms of being able to speak Spanglish, right? Talk about the foods that we like, music, and I think that was like the first time that I really brought my whole self in a corporate setting. And then I'm really lucky to have been able to found ThinkNow. That company was purchased by another company, and I didn't go along for that ride. I felt like we still needed a company wholly focused on, multicultural consumers. And that was kind of the idea of founding ThinkNow. And I've been able to go on this entrepreneurial journey, but also, a personal journey in terms of changing what I think that a company should be and how we message. It's like very different in 2021 today than when we founded, right? In terms of, when we first founded the company, my co-founder and I, we wouldn't talk about political things or how we felt, making sure that we don't offend any potential clients. But 2015, 2016, like we said, screw that. And just kind of were like, we're gonna be who we are. So I think I'm lucky that as an entrepreneur, I'm, not only letting the company evolve, but also, I continue to have aha moments myself and how that's reflected through our business.
Yeah, that really sticks with me, because I think that the aha moments still keep coming, at least for me, right? I can speak for other folks, but it comes in new ways. And I think about like in my journey, and I think I worked for College Track, this nonprofit in education for like about 5 or 6 years before I applied to grad school and then started my master's in higher ed program. And it was during that time that I think I was building these like skill sets of understanding the complexities of like my joteria, my jotoness, how I show up in these spaces. Because, I worked with, for a year, I was working with the high school students at the East Palo Alto site, or we say the EPA site. And then from there, I went over to the college side, right? And I was a college success coach fellow, but I was like big brother. I was like la tia. I was like all these other aspects, right? Because I was the one being like, call me back. I know you're not doing well in class. Call me back before I call your mom. Like, so it was me like coming into this role and being myself and being like, look, because I love you, I'm going to be like upfront with you. And this is the reality of when you're in college, right? But it really helped me understand that it's through like the way that I interact, how I build high impact relationships, right? Like coming into a space and like exposing my jotoness as a part of the way that I'm teaching, right? And if you think about it, that was how I was creating the schema pedagogy. That was how I was creating, like how I was theorizing, right? And I didn't have language. So I think when I got into my master's program and I walked into this because I went to USC, the University of Southern California. So it was very elitist, right? Like the space, mind you, it's in the hood. And then you walk on campus and you're like, where the hell am I? Like nada que ver with what was outside down the block, right? But it was in there that I was like, oh, I'm putting language to what I do. I'm putting language to my existence. And now I can break down my joteria in a way to talk about how it goes from pedagogy to a praxis and how like I live it, I'm breathing it. But even to this day, right now, as I'm going through my dissertation, I'm having these new moments of like, oh, this is another part of me that's coming out. This is another part of me where I'm like, you know what? I don't care what people think anymore. The personal is political at this point, and I can't hide myself to appease what I like to call academia, right? As other folks will say. But I'm not here to appease them anymore. I'm here to do the work. I'm here to like, call it what it is, not center Eurocentric ideas of how to conduct research, how to exist in a space, because I wish I had someone like me when I was an undergrad. And so I feel like whether I chose to or not, like now I'm becoming that person that's like, oh, well, we have Sergio. And it's like, oh man, I remember. Like I have to think about what I do as well. Like what message am I trying to give, right? Like what are my morals and my goals and how am I going to pay it forward? Because, someone paid it forward to help me and continue to teach that as I continue to have my aha moments and evolve. And I'm going to shut up now. Go ahead. Jaime, is there anything you want to add to that?
I agree with you about having multiple aha moments throughout our journeys, because I think that a lot of the times we don't just stumble. I think that even just the concept of coming out is such a weird concept. Like we don't come out, we've always existed. And so within the Latino community, like we've always had like the gay tío that like, nunca se casó because he might be estudiado, which is like, was my story, right? Like, no, es que no tiene tiempo porque él estudia, and like getting my master's. And so then my mom would be like, oh, está estudiando, And so that's how people normalize like our queerness, right? They're trying to negotiate their like security or sense of self or making sense of our lives. And then thinking like, I did undergrad and I studied gender studies. And I feel like that's where I was like, wow, I understand that I'm like super masculine presenting, but like my performance is always like high femme performing, or it makes people feel really uncomfortable because they call me flamboyant. Like I love pink, I love Lisa Frank. I'm just like very like, if I'm gonna wear a turquoise backpack with roses on it, and like here's the 6'5" guy like wearing something super like feminine, and people feel really uncomfortable. I also think that some of the aha moments that I've had throughout my journey has been how Latinidad is not a monolith, and how there's a lot of sites of of pain and a lot of sites of erasure within our communities. So like, I think that coalition building is something that we need to really think about how we can, if we're genuinely being authentic about how we need to move forward about what Latinidad is and how it can help queer communities. Just like the way I feel like the LGBT community is very hotel-centric. Sorry, it's true. I think that we need to do better about representing queer cultures in multiple facets, and we need to be showing Latinidad in multiple facets. And I feel like I've only come to those aha moments in like my 30s, right? Because in my 20s, I was like queer Chicano to the max, right? And I didn't understand how my nationalism mindset was like also hurting people that were also marginalized. And so being okay with being wrong and centering myself in a place of learning has been very helpful when moving forward. Because I still want to I want to learn, I want to keep learning and growing, and I'm sure that there'll be more aha moments moving forward, but I don't think that there's one aha moment, but I do think that self-affirming when you come to terms with your own sexuality is the most powerful and the most resilient thing we can do as queer people.
Indeed, thank you for that. And this really leads us into the next question. So the next question is asking, what were or are the stakes of grappling with our group identity? So Latine, Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, and why do you feel the need to approach this topic differently? And if it's okay, can we start off with Mario?
Yeah, I'm so glad I get to start off with this one, this question. Yeah. So it's so interesting. I mean, and I again, something that Jaime pointed to in terms of Latinos not being a monolith, it's so true. And I see it every day through the research that we do, right? So we actually, I believe we conducted 2016, Democratic primaries. A lot of the candidates were using the term Latinx, and that's what really sparked us to kind of dig in deeper to see what the adoption was among U.S. Hispanics in general in a nationally representative sample. And so we conducted that back in 2016, and we found about 2 to 3% of the population identifying as Latinx, of the Latino population identifying as Latinx, with no statistical significant difference in generation, gender, and it was surprising, right? And we got a lot of pushback in terms of that study, which was interesting because we were just like, hey, how do people identify? And it stirred it up back then in terms of people feeling really passionate one way or another. And we got some valid criticism in terms of not having a large enough base size for LGBTQIA. And so we did the study again in 6 months. We doubled that base size. We actually included the ability to identify whether you had a family member, or friend, relative that identified as LGBTQIA to see if that would change the response. And it didn't. We still saw this 2 to 3% among, and then we asked some follow-up questions if they found the term offensive, and to our surprise, there was a large amount of people that found the term Latinx offensive. And so it's just this interesting space. And this is 2017. I mean, I think, was it Forrester just released it this month, another one? I mean, I think it's at 3 to 4%. Not statistically significant, but it is moving towards a little bit more adoption, right? But it's really been a divisive issue for whatever reason among the Latino community, and specific to this term, which has just been kind of interesting to track it from a research perspective. But would love to hear your all thoughts on what's causing this, and because we haven't researched on like the why, right? It's difficult on a quantitative basis to get at the why. We just kind of see the adoption, and we see that, you know, people have strong feelings one way or another. But I feel like there hasn't been a study yet to get at the underpinnings of why.
No, it's so real. Maria, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we think of kind of the transition from Hispanic to Latino, right, there was a lot of pushback, and there's a bit of an ownership behind the identification. And when you take it back and say, how do you identify? We all have kind of our perspective of what identifies us. But when we talk about a Latinx, there's a lot of push up of the X of not defining that dichotomy of gender. And it really, from my perspective, is rooted from a homophobic approach, which we understand that our Latinx communities really grapple with it. The rate of acceptance is very low, and down to my own personal experience. You have parents that love their children, raise and protect them, and at some point they come to the conclusion that because you are part of the LGBTQIA plus community in some spectrum, they'd rather not have you in their life. And, you know, when you talk to those parents, if that child had died, they'd be suffering. But because, you know, the homophobia that was kind of built into their own belief system, attached with kind of the closeness to religion that we all kind of grow up with from you know, the moment we're born, there's a true struggle. So if we're removing the identity of gender, there's a level of acceptance that has to go along with accepting the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's a real challenge. It's kind of that one of those first and long-term barriers that we have to overcome.
Indeed. Thank you for that. And Jaime, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the power of words have been there's a lot of things that like shifting cultural norms is a really difficult thing. And so this new term Latinx, I think, does a lot of things for people. Like it erases indigenous identity, which was the same thing that happened with Hispanic, and it was a term given by the government, and it centers colonization in the founding, because then it erases any other languages in Latin America. And so I do think that I agree with what Maria is saying, that Latinx is a way of, like, I think for me, for queer people, like we are going against two different systems, right? Like we're going against the system of like formal Spanish, right? Because formal Spanish is gendered. And we're saying, hey, there's a group of people that aren't gendered. And so therefore that's challenging a whole system, just like a language, right? There's like a plate like the Real Madrid or something like that like polices the appropriate Spanish. And so they're already like up in arms. And then additionally, like we keep coming up with things in terms of like the academic community, the research community, like that we're putting things onto people as opposed to asking people how they self-identify. And so I recognize that there's like complexities in that alone. Like I call myself a Chicano, but I actually migrated from Mexico. So technically I'm like 100% Mexican, you know, I was born there, but because I have the American experience since I was 2, I call myself a Chicano because that's the experience that I identify with, right? Sergio was born in the US and he calls himself Mexican. And so these are like complexities, and, you know, we've known each other for our whole lives. And so it's interesting to be able to think about what the power of the words have, and how, yeah, of course, I see the pushback coming from the community because we haven't asked the community what they want to be called. We're imposing things onto communities.
That's so real. Thank you for that. And yes, I do say I'm Mexican. That's how I identify. But I think when I think of like these terms, right, and I 100% agree, right, like the power in like words and like what they mean and how they can be imposed on folks, right? But when I think about like Latine and like Latinx, for example, I also look at these terms as disruptors in language, right? Disruptors in existence, disruptors in being, right? Because it's disrupting this this gender binary. It's disrupting like all kinds of aspects of what we are conditioned and socialized to think like this is normal and this is not, right? And so I always think of it in like terms like when I talk to like my ahijado or like, you know, other children in my family, like, oh yeah, like there's, you know, there's the boy, there's the girl, and then there's all these other aspects of what this can look like. And they're like, what? But at the same time, kids are so smart. They capture and they understand, they soak up knowledge like a sponge. And so my attitude has always been like, if we can just start to normalize this at such an age, they're not going to have a problem with it. Like some of our like tias, tios, and elders in our communities that are like, wow, what are you doing? What are you saying? And I think for me personally, so I do identify with Latinx, and I look at it as like personal and political in a lot of ways, right? And I do it in the work that I do, and I do it with like the folks that I like to co-create with. But my thing is always like, I ask you what you like to identify with and what works for you, what speaks to you, right? What makes you feel like, kind of like the other question, like that clicks for me. And then I use that. And so I know for me, I'll use it in like in academic ways, right? I'll use it. I'm not going to go to my house though and tell my dad, hey, Appa, you're Latinx today. So have a seat and get ready. Because my Appa's going to be like, what? Right? And that's fine. I 100% respect that, acknowledge that. But I am going to have conversations with my Appa and say, this is why people use it, or here are ways, you know, to make sense of it. And this is how I use it, Appa, as opposed to being like, no, let's just shut off and like, let's be at our corners and not engage and try to really critically reflect. That's how I think about it. How can we reflect? And I look at terms such as Latinx and Latine as terms that are going to continue to evolve. Mm-hmm. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know that these terms are going to continue to evolve as they start to encompass and embrace and, you know, really incorporate other aspects of what identity is, because identity is really, really complex and there's all these layers. So we can't just be like, oh no, we're all like one, going back to the whole idea of like this whole monolith. No, not at all. And I think about that through my experiences, right? So coming from the Bay Area in California, where it was predominantly Mexican and Central American, a little bit of South American, to going to New York, where everybody was Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, and I was like a minority. And I was like, I've never been in a space where I've been a minority. It's always been, I'm in a space that's majority. And so for me, Latinidad has a whole other aspect because I lived in another space. I had to like, you know, I learned to like embrace and understand. And I was like, oh, okay, this is what it looks like to co-create with these folks, right? So like learning even like vocabulary. So like even like I say chisme, and my friends taught me it's bochinche on the East Coast. And so I was like, oh, okay. So now I know how to tell you I got some bochinche. So we need to go like have some conversation right now. So like simple things like that, right? And so with the next question, and folks already brought this up, but I don't know if anybody else wants to add to this, but what systems are at play and who are the decision makers / power holders? And we'll start off with Maria, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think when we think of decision maker power holders, it's our communities are at large, and really the power is held with education, the power of education, understanding. And I think, like you said, Sergio, it's not about telling someone this is your identity and this is where you're going to call yourself now. It's about just sharing why it's being used and why certain group of individuals prefer to be called this term. I think that's how we gain that sense of community and can come together in an equal understanding that I'm not going to define your identity, so don't define anybody else's identity. And you know, that's kind of when we progress forward and we kind of take the power away from the word a little bit.
And Jaime?
I think that I'm going to pass on this because I do think that I talked a lot of what influences the word of the power. So I'll wait for the next one. Thank you.
No problem. And Mario?
Yeah, I think one of the big kind of power brokers at play from my perspective is the media. Like we saw our study that was just us kind of just putting it out there. There was no opinion attached to it, just data picked up by right-wing media. And it was just crazy to see, you know, and really kind of pointing to the study, saying like, see, here's what the left is trying to call you. And it's frustrating that these terms are kind of positioned like that. Whereas my personal opinion is like, to Sergio's point, identity is situational. It's complex. How you identify in certain spaces, like me personally, I identify as Mexican American. Maybe on Twitter, if I'm tweeting, it's Latinx. If I'm in a corporate space, it's Hispanic. Like, I think it's situational for many people. But a lot of the times you see the media just positioned as either or, a dichotic relationship, and that's detrimental to kind of the evolution of terms and how we identify. So I mean, that from my perspective, I feel like the media, there is some vested interest in making it a fight, and I think that's unfortunate, as opposed to Maria's point, like a jumping point for education.
Indeed, thank you for that. And so for the next question, they're asking, what do you want the community to know? What is the seen and unforeseen impact of acceptance and understanding of queerness in Latinidad? So we can start off with Maria.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the unseen impacts is understanding the impacts to our youth. I see myself, and where I stand today, I can be myself and care less who accepts it and who doesn't. I am me and I exist. But our youth doesn't feel that way. As we think back to our teenage years, we're all looking for acceptance, for belonging, and it plays a big part of our development. I was recently reading a study where 40% of our Latinx queer youth think of suicide. About a 30% start planning for suicide, and about 20% go through with an attempt. So we're thinking of our kids growing up in an environment where they feel they don't belong, and the only way to resolve that is to no longer exist in this world. And I think those are some of the impacts that folks don't really take into account when we're having these discussions, and they're really the most important. We also have people of color, including Latinx, 8 out of 10 more chance of being homeless through their youth. And that's a tremendous impact when we think of, the progression where we want to grow as a community and the impacts and representation we want to have in higher education, in corporate, in businesses. It's seeing that representation. So I think those are some of the key things that we have to keep in mind when we're having these discussions.
No, that's so real. And thank you for sharing that. And I find it's ironic in a lot of ways, because we have the internet. Now we have like information at our fingertips at any moment, right? Like, you don't have to go sneak off to Barnes and Noble to read some like queer literature anymore. Like, that's what Jaime and I used to do when we were in high school. Like, let's cut class, go to Barnes and Noble and read up on something that's queer to like have an understanding of ourselves, because we couldn't just get on our cell phones and Google it, right? Like, we couldn't just do that. But it's super ironic that we're in a space and a place where information is at our fingertips, and yet the idea of acceptance is becoming harder in a lot of ways, even with having all this information at a grasp on TV, on aspects of social media. So that's so crazy. Mario, any thoughts?
Yeah. Can you repeat the question? So
No worries. Yeah. So what do you want the community to know? What is the seen and unforeseen impact of acceptance and understanding of queerness in Latinidad?
Yeah, I mean, I think conversations like these are so important, right? I'm a cisgender, straight Latino male, and to your point, Sergio, like I've read out, right? Like, being in the market research industry, like I've read the literature, but humanizing it, and I mean, hearing like the statistics from Maria and your stories, I feel like that's what's missing in the conversation, right? Like, it's out there, a lot of this information, but hearing real stories, I just think humanizes it and puts into the forefront the importance of more inclusive terminology and how we identify, because it has real impact in the world.
Indeed. And Jaime, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how even like my family, one of my sisters is always asking me like, oh, why does everything have to be gay with you? Like she asks me that, right? And I'm always telling her like, well, like the fact that you can like hold your husband's hand in public and like not worry about getting killed or having spaces where that's even socially acceptable, like that doesn't happen in queer people's lives. Like we don't just get asked by our crush to go to prom. We don't get to experience what it's like. I was like, up until 2012, we couldn't legally get married. So I couldn't like sign my life away to a man if I wanted to. Like you, that's normalized behavior to you, right? And so I was like, that's such a privileged question to ask. And yesterday, I'm in a group text with my sisters all the time. And so I'm always sending them like gay things all the time. And Banda El Recodo has the first gay and lesbian representation in their music video in their newest song. And I'm like a banda through and through lover. Like if I could go to banda club every weekend, I totally would, you know? And so I was like crying for half of the day because it was the first time that like a banda song had a gay couple in it, you know? And like, that's like power. That's power to be able to see yourself in the media. Like that's power. And so I just think about how like, I wish people could understand that at a younger age. Like I shouldn't be 35 to be able to feel like my life has meaning.
No, that's so real. And thank you for sharing that. I think for me, I look at it as it's complex because it's yes and, right? And we're so used to being told or conditioned to think that like it's either or, no, but, right? And so really conceptualizing, yes, I'm Joto and I'm Latinx. Yes, I exist in all these ways, right? Yes, I have to negotiate at times and in a lot of spaces, right? Whether or not I'm going to be more Joto today in this room. Am I going to be more Latinx or Latine? Am I going to, or am I going to be quiet? Like for my safety, like let me just be quiet because I also understand that like, I'm cisgender. I present in a way. The moment I speak, it's a whole other world, right? My Jotoness is like beautiful. It shines through. But if I don't say anything, I know that I can walk into a space and I hold these privileges, right? And a lot of times I think, well, about my safety. And so I think for me, it's really important to really dive into like, yes, and this is also an existing part of me. Yes, and this is, why I am this way. Yes, and I think because like social media has really also changed the way we learn, right? And so like I compare like my experiences, like, yes, we had cell phones, but we weren't dependent on cell phones like that per se, right? Yes, we had like access to the internet, but like I didn't get my first computer until I went off to college, and it was through a scholarship that I got my first computer. And I was like, oh my God, I have a computer. Now I can like Google things, but I still wasn't dependent on it per se. Now I'm so used to like, just Google it, get on your phone, or, blah, 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 just go on YouTube. Someone will give you a tutorial, right? And so it goes back to this irony of like, yes, we have this right here, but we also like don't look for it anymore because we know it's right there. And so a lot of these things happen, right? And so I think for me, and like the way that I teach, right? The way that I come into spaces with folks, I'm always like, yes, and yes, you can be, yes, I can be Joto and Latinx and first gen. And, like soon going to be less than the 1% that's going to be a doctor, right? Like, yes, I'm all of these things, and I have to figure out how I negotiate it, how I carry it with me. Where does it matter more? Where does it matter less? Where can I just be my authentic self? And so it's a lot of those things I feel like we have to grapple with. So for the last question, and this is for the audience as well, but for the panelists, the question is, what can I do about it? And this question focuses on the audience and like what we can do as people. So if it's okay, I think I'd like to start because I think that's like where I'm at right now in my life, right? And so I think for me, I'm diving into this in my dissertation and just how I show up as a PhD candidate, as a Joto scholar, right? As a Joto scholar activist kind of mindset. I think it's like continue to push the boundaries and really like reshift and refocus what research can look like, what pedagogy can look like, right? And so I'm very hardcore about like, I'm approaching this work through, like, for example, a plática methodology instead of interviews. Why? Because pláticas are centering folks where they're at. I use Joteria pedagogy and I theorize with Joteria because I'm not about queer theory. Queer theory doesn't speak to the Latina, Latinx community the way Joteria can, right? And Joteria has a lot of limitations. And so I'm in a space where I want to learn. So it's yes, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to use these methodological approaches to dive into this work, to look at what it's like to navigate higher education as someone who can identify with some aspect of Latinidad and queerness. And what do they use for it, right? And so for me, that's what I submit to publish. That's what I submit to present. That's what I submit, like on Twitter. Like when you see like my Twitter, like I talk a lot about these things because I think it's my job to continue to push these boundaries of what research can look like and how research can connect to the way we create knowledge, not the way we're taught to think that knowledge is supposed to be created through these Eurocentric lenses, through a academia mindset. To me, it's like, no, it happens in the community. It happens at the club when we're in a space where we got each other's back and was like, oh no, we're going home together, girl, because when we walk out of the club, we're not in a safe space anymore, right? And so that's how I think that that's what I'm doing about it. And I'm also, I come harder into spaces like I'm Joto and Latinx, like what's good? Like this is how I'm showing up in academia. So if you like it, awesome. If you don't, well, there's other avenues for you. You don't, like I'm not gonna be everybody's cup of tea, and that's totally okay. And so Maria, if you wanna respond to this question.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Like I think similar to you, it's just being your true self, creating that representation. I think Mario mentioned earlier, it wasn't until he saw someone that with his same demographics, someone from the Hispanic Latinx community being on top and changing the conversation that he realized that he could do it as well. I find myself in a financial space where Latinx, LGBTQ plus is one of the minorities, and you don't see it as success. So it's trailblazing to create that path. But as it's often kind of talked about in the political space, maybe being the first to arrive, but not the last, and leaving the ladder behind you so that others can climb, and reaching back to say, how can I support the same group of community, represent myself fully as a member of Latinx community, as a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, and say we belong, we're contributors, and we're special in our own way. So let's reach back down, bring those numbers up. Let's make sure that there's a space for everyone to do so. And I'm fortunate enough to work at a company that's been around over 90 years. It has a very strong tradition, but is very open and working really strongly to push that diversity, equity, and inclusion forward within our corporate grounds. So it's using their power, their strength, their establishment, and saying, okay, let's bring people on board and make it a positive.
Indeed, thank you for that. Mario, any thoughts?
Yeah, so for me, it's interesting. I think kind of how I see myself is like bridging. Let me rephrase that. Like corporate America is way behind. Like I would say, like
higher ed is too. So.
No,
I feel like all our spaces are, which is why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, like this conversation, I would say, like, it's bleeding edge in terms of the conversations that we should be having. But like corporate America, like we literally got hired last year just to give them an overview on what Latinx is. Like that's not even something our company does. Like we do research and we find respondents and create surveys, but they wanted us to come in, one of the large sports organizations, and just give them a primer on Latinx. So I think for us, it's kind of just understanding where people are at. But I feel like that work is important, right? I mean, we were presenting to all 30 plus team CMOs, and the data and the stories and the evolution. I mean, we went back, right, kind of telling them the evolution about how Hispanic came to be, how Latino came to be, and contextualized it in a historical perspective, and you know, the LGBTQIA plus origins of Latinx, because they just wanted to understand, like, is this something we should use from a marketing perspective? But, you know, I think back to my original point about the media and marketing and advertising, I feel like how we reflected in those spaces has really an impact on broader culture. So like, I hope that the research and that work we do helps move the conversation forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Jaime.
I would jump on the bandwagon with Mario saying how media represents us is really important, but also how we choose to, whatever media we choose to create, right? Like, I'm just so grateful that like I can run a Queer Joy Book Club through Instagram, and it's a platform that's free to people, and like it shouldn't just be held in spaces where like you have to be in the ivory tower to analyze literature or to just like chop it up with a girlfriend and have a good time, you know, like. I love. I co-host the book club with different people, and I try to bring different perspectives because, like, I know that I'm just like strictly like a hotel man, and I'm just like not. I won't always get the other side, right? And so, like the love of learning, the centering of joy, and the centering of like queer Latinidad is really important to me. So, as long as I keep evolving and growing, I think that those things will help just like the larger audience, and hopefully somebody finds our conversations fruitful or just wants to join the discussion even better.
Indeed, thank you for that. Any like last minute thoughts, reflections, things you want to blurt out? Anybody?
I want to give a shout out to Carla for inviting us to this. Carla was one of our mentors in high school, and she saw our little hotel cells, and she was just like a really strong, empowered woman, and we like looked up to her. We like
Still look up
still look up to her. Yeah, we still look up, like we're still her groupies. So
thank you for that. Anybody else?
I think just a quick thank you to all of you. I've learned so much by just this conversation. Feel very honored to have been part of it and learn and contribute to the discussion.
Indeed.
Yeah,
right.
Likewise. Thank you for inviting me part of this conversation. It's so great. You know, like I'm just in data and numbers all the time. So it's really cool to be surrounded such great, smart people and like contextualize it in real stories.
Easy. Well, thank you all so much. Well, and thank you to the panelists and everyone for joining us from Latinx Quest or LTX Quest. We hope everyone enjoys the rest of the programming, and please feel free to look us up on social media, etc. If you want to continue having conversations, you can always find me on Twitter, and we'll make sure that all of our social media outlets are posted for folks to reach out. And with that, thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.